Hello and welcome to this video on section 7.1, Rules of Implication 1, Part 2. In this video we're going to take the first 4 rules of implication which we learned last time, that is in our last video, and we're going to apply them to prove certain conclusions. So I have the first 4 rules over here in the box written in purple. And I have a proof that we need to do over on the left. The proof consists of 2 premises which are numbered as 1 and 2. So number 1 we have if not C, then if A, then C. And premise number 2 is not C. Our conclusion is under the / here on the right, and that's the not A. We're going to prove that this conclusion follows by filling in the gaps, and that basically means filling in more premises below premise 1 and 2. So that's where the rules will come in. We're going to use the rules to deduce further premises until we get to the conclusion, which is the not A. This will show that the argument is valid, because remember that the rules express valid forms. And so if we use the rules to get to the conclusion, we've shown that the argument is valid as well. Okay, so let's brainstorm here as to where we need to start. Okay, notice that the first premise is a conditional statement. We have the not C as the antecedent, and then we have the if A then C as the consequent. That whole proposition there, if A then C, is a consequent, right? And then we have the not C by itself. Well, let's think here in terms of the rules on the right. Is there a rule where you have an antecedent, a consequent, and then the antecedent again? And the answer to that is yes. Modus ponens expresses that form, right? Let's pretend that the not C represents the P. Let's pretend that the if A then C represents the Q. And then we have the P again, right? Well, remember, if P then Q, P therefore Q, that's what modus ponens expresses, right? So for line 3, we can derive or deduce Q, which in this case is this whole proposition if A then C. So we can write if A then C. This time we can get rid of the parentheses because we only needed the parentheses to separate that consequent from the antecedent. So now we could get rid of the parentheses. I copied and pasted the horseshoe, and so if A then C follows by applying the rule modus ponens to lines 1 and 2. So we do need to cite 1 and 2 as the lines that we've used, and then we abbreviate modus ponens by MP. Okay, so I've derived or deduced another premise, which is 3. I did it validly by using that rule, but we are not done yet. We do not have the not A. So we do need to make another move, or perhaps more than one move, in order to get to the not A. Okay, so let's go to line 4 and see what rule we can apply in order to derive or deduce another premise. Okay, well, notice that what we have now is if A then C. So we ask ourselves, okay, well, what rules have conditionals like this? And it turns out that there are actually 3 rules that now have conditionals, right? We have the pure hypothetical syllogism has the conditional, we have the modus tollens as a conditional, and then again we have the modus ponens as having a conditional, right? It does not look like we're going to use the hypothetical syllogism, right? Because we don't have another conditional statement. We do have the first conditional statement, but it doesn't look like that expresses the same form, right? The question is, can we use modus ponens again? Well, if we were going to use modus ponens again, we would need the A by itself, right? So that we could get C, for example. We don't even want C. we want not A. So the question is, what form do we have expressed here such that we could derive the not A? Well, if we notice carefully, if A then C and not C, that's what we have in premise 2, reflects modus tollens, right? So let's pretend that the A represents the P, the C represents the Q. Well, then what we have here is not Q, right? Because we have not C. Okay, well, if that's not Q, then we could derive not P, which in this case would be the not A. Okay, so not A follows, and it follows by applying the rule of modus tollens to lines 2 and 3, right? So we would cite this as 2 and 3 modus tollens. And now we have the conclusion that we wanted, which was the not A. We did so by applying the two rules here, the first two rules. And so we're done. We have proved that the conclusion does follow, and and that means that the argument is valid. And we have done so by using these two rules. Okay, let us do another proof so that we get more practice. The more practice, the better. The key here is going to be to practice as much as we possibly can. Practice is going to make perfect here. Okay, so here we have another one. Again, lines 1 and 2 are premises. So the first premise is F or if D then T. The second premise is not F, but notice that this time we have a third premise, which is D, right? And then we have the conclusion over here on the far right as T. So that is the conclusion that we want to prove. So now we start by asking ourselves, okay, well, which rules will apply here? Okay, well, notice that we have a disjunction in line 1. And so what we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, which rule involves a disjunction? And the only rule that involves a disjunction is P or Q. So we know that we are pretty much going to be using the disjunctive syllogism. Okay, well then that means that our P is our F, our Q is our whole other disjunct over here on the right, which is the if D then T. And then we have our not P, right, as our not F. Okay, well, if our P is our F, our not P is our not F, then by use of the disjunctive syllogism, the if D then T would have to follow, right? So we could deduce if D then T onto line 4. Again, remember, we get rid of the parentheses because we only use the parentheses to separate the two disjuncts. And our rule here is lines 1 and 2, disjunctive syllogism, or DS, and that's it. We've deduced or derived another premise. Okay, are we done? Well, no. Remember, we're trying to prove T, right? Okay, so we go on to line 5, and with line 5 we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, how do we get the T? Okay, well, look at lines 3 and 4. We have a conditional statement that has the T, right? And so that's where we want to look. We want to look to see which one has the T. And it is contained in line 4 as the consequent of that conditional statement. We have D as the antecedent, right? And oh, look, notice we have D here. Okay, well, that looks like modus ponens, doesn't it? If P, then Q, P, therefore Q, right? That's modus ponens over here on the top right. And so we know that T will follow by the application of modus ponens to lines 3 and 4. Okay, so that means that we do have to cite those two lines, 3 and 4, and we have to cite the rule that we used there, and that rule was modus ponens, so that's MP, right, capital letters. And that's it. We are done with the whole proof, right? We've proven T. We had to use two rules here. Let me get rid of the squigglies there. We had to use two rules there to get to the t, but we've shown that that conclusion does validly follow given the three premises, we have three premises here, and given the application of the rules of inference, right? So these are the reason why they are called rules of, well, they're called rules of implication, but they also could also be easily called rules of inference, is because they do imply certain premises, and that's what we've shown here, that certain premises are implied if we take those rules seriously, which we should, because they are in a sense logical laws. Okay, that's it. The key here will be to practice and derive these conclusions. The two problems that I've done here are actually from your homework, so this is going to be a good guide for you to be able to do your homework.